This
As the
roasted meat
evening
is
sun sinks
excellent.
behind the distant hills, the Viking village
Indeed.
lies under a heavy blanket of
And the
snow,
stew is
the
hearty.
air so cold it feels like it could cut through the thickest of hides. A biting wind howls across the barren landscape, and the once bustling village now appears still, shrouded in the cold, dark embrace of a harsh winter. The sky overhead, a deep shade of gray, seems endless. A sense of isolation fills the air, amplified by the solitude of the village, which lies in stark contrast to the warmth and activity of summer. For the Vikings, this cold wasn't simply a seasonal inconvenience. It was a force that shaped their very existence. A force that tested their survival instincts, their innovation, and their ability to endure when the world around them seemed intent on freezing everything in its path. The villagers, huddled inside their longhouses, would feel the weight of the cold pressing against the thick wooden walls, the coldness creeping in around cracks in the timber. Yet they are not entirely at the mercy of the elements. The heart of the village is the warmth that radiates from small hearths, flames flickering in the darkness, but this warmth is more precious than gold, and the fires they depend on are not always as reliable as they would hope. This is where the mystery lies. In a time before modern comforts, before the luxury of central heating and warm blankets, how did people survive the brutal Scandinavian winters without fire? How did they keep warm when the very thing that could provide that warmth, fire, was, at times, impossible to obtain or maintain? The answer is a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of the Viking people. This was a culture forged in adversity, where every person's ability to endure the cold was not only a matter of survival, but of life itself. In the Viking Age, the struggle against the cold was not something they simply endured, it was something they had to constantly outwit. There was no instant solution, no single method that guaranteed safety against the freezing temperatures that could freeze the blood in their veins. But the Vikings were resourceful. They understood the need to preserve warmth in every way they could. They didn't just use fire for heat, they understood that it was just one tool in a larger, more intricate system of survival strategies. When fire failed them, when the weather made lighting a flame nearly impossible, they turned to every other option they could, utilizing the very materials and skills their environment offered them. The story of how Viking Age people kept warm in a time when fire was elusive is not just a tale of primitive survival. It's a story of human ingenuity, creativity, and a deeper understanding of the world around them. Every piece of fur, every stone, every well-crafted longhouse was not merely a product of circumstance. It was a deliberate choice, a result of centuries of trial and error, shaped by an understanding that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant mastering the environment in ways others could not. In this narrative, we dive deep into the Viking methods for staying warm, methods that were both simple and sophisticated, blending ancient knowledge with a deep respect for the natural world. The Viking people understood the value of warmth. It wasn't just a comfort, it was a necessity, a matter of life and death. As the snow drifted quietly down over their villages, the Vikings were constantly negotiating with the elements, always seeking ways to balance survival with comfort. But as we will discover, warmth was not a mere luxury, it was a matter of survival, a key to understanding how they lived and thrived in one of the harshest climates on Earth. At the heart of this survival story is the relationship between the Vikings and fire itself. Fire was their constant companion, both a blessing and a curse. In a land where the sun could disappear for months and the cold could freeze the sea, fire was their greatest weapon against the elements. But the limitations of fire became clear. Wood, the fuel necessary to keep fire burning, was scarce in many parts of Scandinavia, and even when available, it was often difficult to keep burning for long periods during the long winters. A storm might blow through, and with it, a biting wind that would snuff out their small flames. Or perhaps the snow would blanket the ground so heavily that it became impossible to gather enough firewood to keep the hearth alive. In such a world, fire was both an ally and an enemy. It could provide warmth and light in the darkest hours of the winter, but it was not always a dependable source of heat. The Vikings were not helpless in the face of this uncertainty. They had long known that survival didn't rely solely on fire, it also depended on their ability to adapt, to make use of the land and materials around them in creative and unexpected ways. They knew that the cold was something they could not conquer directly, but they could manipulate it. They could learn how to insulate their bodies, how to trap the heat in their homes, and how to make the most of the little warmth they had. Through a combination of clothing, shelter, and simple yet effective tools, they managed to survive, even thrive, in a world where fire was sometimes as elusive as a dream. But it wasn't just about technology. The Vikings had an understanding of the land that allowed them to read the weather, to predict when the cold would come and how best to prepare for it. Their knowledge wasn't just based on survival skills. It was based on the deep, spiritual connection they had with the land and the forces of nature that shaped it. For the Vikings, the cold was a part of their world, but it was not the end of their story. They understood that winter could be endured, that it could be outlasted, and that warmth could be found in places beyond the hearth. In the following sections, we'll uncover the remarkable ways they achieved this, using methods that continue to fascinate and inspire to this day. For now, imagine being there with them. The sharp, biting wind cutting through your cloak, the snow crunching underfoot, and the only light coming from a flickering flame inside the longhouse. The cold is everywhere, threatening to consume all that you have built. Yet, you know that within this community, warmth is possible, not just in the fire, but in the very way they choose to live, together, strong and resilient. And despite the long, frozen nights, you can feel that warmth, a warmth that is as much a product of spirit as it is of fire. The Scandinavian landscape during the Viking Age was a world shaped by extremes, a place where the seasons themselves seemed to wage a relentless war against those who dared to settle upon its frozen soil. Winter was not merely a season, it was a long, unyielding trial, a vast expanse of biting cold that could last for months, stretching the limits of endurance and testing every aspect of daily life. Snow blanketed the ground for weeks on end, and the daylight that did manage to pierce the thick winter skies was pale, weak, and fleeting. The cold seeped into every corner, into the walls of the longhouses, into the fibers of clothing, into the very bones of those who walked upon the icy terrain. To survive here required not just courage, but an intimate understanding of the environment and an unshakable determination to endure. In the spring and summer, life held a certain rhythm. The land offered abundance, with forests dense with timber and animals, rivers brimming with fish, and fields that, for a short time, could sustain crops. But winter was different. It stripped the world bare, leaving only frozen earth and biting wind, a landscape that seemed indifferent to human struggle. The cold did not merely chill the skin, it challenged the very concept of survival. Tasks that were simple in warmer months became Herculean. Gathering food, tending to livestock, and even moving from one place to another required extraordinary effort. Frozen rivers blocked passage, snowdrifts swallowed familiar trails, and the wind cut across the plains with a precision that left no part of the body untouched. For a Viking, the cold was an omnipresent force, one that shaped not just daily routines but the very culture of the people. Life had to be planned with winter in mind, months in advance. Food had to be stored, animals sheltered, and firewood stockpiled to last through the longest nights. Every action was dictated by the demands of survival. Children learned early the importance of layering their clothing, of moving swiftly through the cold, and of recognizing the signs of approaching storms. Adults moved with a quiet efficiency, knowing that hesitation or carelessness could result in frostbite or worse. The land demanded respect, and only those who understood its rules could hope to endure. The harshness of the climate also influenced social structures. Longhouses were built not just as homes, but as sanctuaries against the elements, designed to house extended families and preserve warmth. The proximity of family members provided shared body heat, and communal work became an essential part of life. Daily tasks, from weaving wool to butchering animals, were timed with the seasons, ensuring that the community could withstand the coldest months. Winter was a time of preparation, endurance, and collective effort, a season that forged resilience and camaraderie. Isolation was another significant challenge. Villages could be cut off for days or even weeks by heavy snowfall or storms, leaving families to rely solely on their stored provisions and skills. Communication with neighboring settlements was limited, and the harsh environment amplified the sense of vulnerability. In these moments, The Vikings had to trust in their knowledge of the land, their ingenuity, and the bonds that tied their community together. The cold created a tension that was both physical and psychological, pressing upon every aspect of life, reminding the Vikings constantly that survival was never guaranteed. The environment also dictated how Vikings dressed, ate, and moved. Clothing had to be carefully designed for insulation and mobility, using layers of wool and animal hides to trap warmth. Meals had to be hearty and sustaining, providing the energy required to endure the physical strain of winter labor. Travel was restricted to essential journeys, often using sleds or skis to navigate through deep snow. Every choice carried consequences, and mistakes could mean exposure to freezing temperatures with deadly results. Even the simple act of stepping outside required calculation and courage, as the cold could penetrate even the thickest furs if underestimated. Yet, for all its brutality, the cold was not merely a force of destruction. It was also a defining characteristic of the Viking world, a challenge that shaped their ingenuity, culture, and way of life. The long winters demanded that they innovate, using the materials at hand to create warmth and comfort. They learned to store heat, to insulate their homes, to craft clothing that would repel frost, and to work with the land rather than against it. Their survival was a testament to human adaptability, an intricate dance between necessity and creativity. Stories and legends from this era reflect the omnipresence of the cold. Myths and sagas often describe heroes and gods contending with icy landscapes, a reflection of how deeply the environment was woven into the Viking psyche. The frost was a character in their stories, a force to be respected and feared, but also understood and countered. By observing the seasons, predicting storms, and developing strategies to endure, the Vikings transformed the cold from an enemy into a teacher, a relentless tutor that demanded skill, foresight, and courage. The psychological impact of the cold cannot be understated. Enduring long periods of darkness, isolation, and freezing temperatures forged resilience in a way that few other experiences could. Communities learned to find warmth not only in fire and clothing but in human connection and shared knowledge. The cold created bonds that were both practical and emotional. It forced cooperation, nurtured innovation, and inspired solutions that were both simple and brilliant. Every home, every hearth, and every layer of clothing was a manifestation of this intimate relationship with a harsh and unforgiving world. By understanding the struggles of life in this cold, harsh land, we gain insight not only into the physical endurance of the Vikings but also into the depth of their resourcefulness and determination. The environment dictated the rhythms of their lives, the design of their homes, and even the structure of their communities. Every survival tactic, every innovative solution, and every cultural tradition can be traced back to the challenges imposed by winter. In this way, the cold was not just a backdrop. It was a force that shaped the very essence of Viking society, instilling a resilience that would become legendary. As we explore further, it becomes clear that surviving the winter was not a matter of chance but of preparation, knowledge, and ingenuity. The Vikings' intimate understanding of their environment allowed them to face challenges that would have overwhelmed lesser societies. The strategies they developed to endure the cold, through clothing, shelter, tools, and social cooperation, reveal a sophisticated and deeply practical approach to survival. And in appreciating this, we come closer to understanding how the Viking people not only survived but thrived in one of the most demanding climates on Earth, turning adversity into an enduring testament to human resilience and adaptability. Fire, in the Viking Age, was not just a convenience. It was a lifeline. It was the difference between life and death, warmth and freezing cold, hope and despair. It was the source of light during the long, endless nights, the heat that turned a barren and frozen world into a place of survival. But despite its importance, fire was elusive, rare, and difficult to maintain in the harsh environment of Scandinavia, especially in winter. The Vikings, ever resourceful and inventive, depended on fire as one of their most crucial tools for survival. Yet, they also understood that fire itself could be fleeting and fragile, easily snuffed out by the howling winds or doused by the relentless snowfall that defined their winters. In this unforgiving land, wood, the very fuel needed to keep the fires burning, was a precious commodity. Forests in many areas were sparse, and the winter winds often tore through the trees that stood, bending them at impossible angles and depriving the land of their shelter. Even when wood was available, it was rarely dry enough to catch a flame easily. Vikings would have to gather and store firewood carefully, ensuring that it was protected from the moisture and the wet conditions that could easily render it unusable. Wood became a currency in its own right, traded and hoarded with great care. For the Viking people, fire was not just something to keep warm by, it was a rare and invaluable resource, one that could easily slip through their fingers if not managed properly. Every night, as the cold wind swept over the frozen landscape, the Vikings would gather around the hearths of their longhouses, watching the flickering flames dance in the darkness. The fire was their sanctuary, providing the warmth and light that allowed them to cook their food, melt snow for drinking water, and ward off the chill that threatened to seep into their very bones. But despite its power, fire was far from guaranteed. The weather, often unpredictable, could blow a storm through the village, extinguishing the flames before anyone even noticed. In such moments, the Vikings would be left with no warmth, no light, and no comfort, forced to endure the deep cold until they could somehow rekindle the fire. It was in these moments of desperation that the Vikings showed their true resilience. They developed an intricate understanding of fire, of how to start it, maintain it, and protect it. Their methods of fire starting were far from simple. They relied on a mix of natural resources, ingenuity, and learned skill. Stones could be struck together to produce sparks, but this method was tricky and often unreliable in the wet, damp conditions of the north. Fire-making wasn't something that could be done quickly or easily. It required patience, persistence, and a deep respect for the force they were trying to control. The Vikings had an intimate relationship with fire, one that was shaped by necessity. They understood how to build fires that could withstand the elements, how to construct fire pits that were sheltered from the wind and rain, and how to preserve the fire once it was started. The hearths in their longhouses were designed not just for warmth but for efficiency. They used materials that could trap heat and minimize the waste of fuel. The Vikings had mastered the art of creating small, controlled fires that would burn steadily for hours, allowing the family to gather around the warmth while using as little fuel as possible. Fire was not something to be wasted, it was a precious commodity, and every log burned was a conscious choice. At times, fire was not merely something that kept the body warm, it was a source of emotional warmth, a unifier of families. Longhouse living meant that everyone, from the elders to the youngest children, would sit around the fire, sharing stories and meals. The crackle of the fire became the heartbeat of the home, a sound that was as essential to the Vikings as the warmth it provided. As they gathered around the hearth, they would exchange stories of their ancestors, tales of gods and heroes, of battles fought and journeys undertaken. The fire itself was part of these stories, a living force that was just as integral to their way of life as the people who surrounded it. But fire was not only contained within the walls of their homes. For the Vikings, fire was a constant companion, whether they were sailing across the icy waters or hunting in the frozen forests. When they ventured out into the wilderness, they would carry small fire-starting kits with them, ready to make fire whenever the need arose. They knew that without fire, they would be vulnerable to the elements, exposed to the dangers of frostbite, hypothermia, and the silent, creeping cold that could take hold of their bodies in an instant. Fire was a tool of survival, one that could be used to signal other groups, cook food, or keep wild animals at bay. Yet, despite all their knowledge and ingenuity, fire could never be fully relied upon. Even the most experienced Viking could struggle to light a fire on a damp day, especially if they were caught outside without proper shelter. A cold, wet morning could leave their tinder useless, their matches damp, and their kindling uncooperative. In these moments, fire could seem like a cruel tease, always just out of reach, always slipping away when it was needed most. The Vikings, understanding this vulnerability, were always looking for ways to preserve and protect their flames. In the deep winter, when the cold was at its harshest, they would sometimes sleep with small embers of the fire safely tucked away, a practice known as keeping a live ember. This ember would be carefully guarded through the night, sheltered under a pile of ash or placed inside a ceramic pot, so that the fire could be rekindled in the morning. It was a simple but effective method, a way of ensuring that warmth would never be entirely lost, even in the most extreme conditions. But fire was never something to be taken for granted. It was a force of nature, one that could not be controlled with certainty. Vikings knew that fire, like the land they lived on, was both a source of life and a reminder of the unforgiving world around them. They learned to respect it, to work with it, to keep it alive as long as possible. But they also understood that fire could disappear in an instant, leaving them in the cold, waiting for another chance to catch a spark. And so, the struggle for warmth continued. As the Vikings faced the long, dark nights of winter, fire became both a symbol of their strength and a reminder of their vulnerability. It was something that could warm their homes, light their path, and sustain their spirits, but it was never guaranteed. Fire was as much a part of the Viking spirit as anything else, a force they depended on, respected, and feared in equal measure. The unpredictable nature of fire mirrored the very land the Vikings inhabited, beautiful, fierce, and full of danger. It was a force that could give life, but also take it away, and in the harsh cold of winter, fire remained one of the most precious and elusive treasures they possessed. In the cold, unforgiving winters of the Viking Age, survival often came down to one simple but vital element: clothing. As essential as fire was to warmth, so too was the Vikings' wardrobe, a carefully constructed blend of furs, wool, and leather. Clothing wasn't just a matter of covering the body, it was a matter of life and death, a shield against the elements that could freeze a person to their core. The Vikings understood this intimately, and their clothing innovations reflect a deep knowledge of their environment, a keen sense of practicality, and a remarkable resourcefulness in the face of relentless cold. To step outside in a Viking village during winter was to face the raw, biting cold of the northern winds, the frost that clung to everything it touched, and the ever-present threat of snow and ice. Every Viking, from the strongest warrior to the youngest child, would be wrapped in multiple layers of protective clothing. But it wasn't just about layering for warmth, it was about creating a system of insulation that could hold the heat of the body close and trap it within the garments, all while allowing for movement and flexibility. The most important and foundational garment in Viking attire was the woolen tunic. Wool was an extraordinary material, one that the Vikings knew how to use to its fullest potential. It was not only incredibly warm but also water-resistant, making it ideal for the harsh, wet winters of Scandinavia. Wool had the remarkable ability to retain heat even when it became damp, which was essential in an environment where snow and rain could quickly soak through the clothes. But it wasn't just about function, wool was also a material of cultural significance. It was closely tied to Viking identity and the economy. Wool was grown locally, spun by hand, and woven into fabric that could be made into tunics, cloaks, and even blankets. It was a practical choice, but also a reflection of the Vikings' self-sufficiency and their ability to make the most of their natural resources. Over this base layer, Vikings would wear a cloak or cape, often made of fur or sheepskin, which provided an additional layer of insulation. The fur was particularly valuable for its thermal properties. Animal pelts, especially those of the reindeer, were thick and dense, creating a barrier against the cold. Fur also had the ability to trap air within its fibers, which further increased its insulating ability. These furs were often obtained through hunting or trade, and the Vikings were highly skilled at preparing them to maximize their usefulness. The process of tanning and curing hides was time-consuming, but it resulted in clothing that was not only functional but also durable, able to withstand years of harsh weather without deteriorating. The Vikings were also known for their skill in creating leather garments. Leather, while not as insulating as wool or fur, was used strategically to reinforce clothing in places that were subject to wear and tear. Leather boots, for instance, were essential for protecting the feet from snow, ice, and cold ground. These boots were often lined with fur or thick wool socks, ensuring that the feet stayed warm even in the deepest snow. Viking leatherwork was impressive, with intricate stitching and precise crafting, resulting in shoes and armor that were both practical and long-lasting. One of the most remarkable innovations in Viking clothing was the use of layered clothing to trap body heat. The Vikings didn't simply wear a single thick garment to keep warm. They understood the importance of layering and how different materials could work together to maximize insulation. Beneath the wool tunic, They would often wear a linen shirt, which served as a breathable base layer. The linen absorbed sweat, allowing the wool and fur layers to work more effectively by keeping the body dry. On top of the tunic, a woolen belt would often be worn to keep everything in place, while cloaks of thick, layered wool or fur draped over the shoulders, further trapping heat and protecting against wind. The attention to detail in Viking clothing was astounding, especially considering the lack of modern tools or techniques. Every garment had a purpose, every piece of clothing worked in harmony with the others to create a system of warmth and protection. Vikings didn't just wear clothing, they created an intricate layering system designed to keep out the cold, retain body heat, and allow for movement during work or combat. Whether they were tending to animals, forging weapons, or sailing across icy seas, their clothing was built to withstand the rigors of the environment while keeping them warm and comfortable. The clothing was also designed for movement. Unlike the bulky garments that we might associate with winter today, Viking attire allowed for flexibility. Tunics, trousers, and cloaks were often tailored for fit, ensuring that Vikings could move freely whether they were on a long journey, hunting game, or preparing for battle. The clothing wasn't just for warmth, it was part of the Vikings' everyday toolkit, a necessary piece of equipment for surviving the brutal winters. Their clothing allowed them to move quickly, adjust to sudden changes in temperature, and endure the elements for long stretches without feeling the biting cold. Yet, Viking clothing was more than just functional. It was also a reflection of their status and identity. Like much of Viking society, clothing could signal one's position within the community. Wealthier Vikings, especially those with ties to trade or royalty, might wear clothing made from the finest wool, fur, and leather, with intricate patterns woven into their tunics or cloaks. Brightly dyed fabrics, rare and expensive, were prized possessions that indicated a person's wealth and influence. These brightly colored garments stood out against the white snow, a stark contrast to the otherwise muted tones of everyday clothing. For the Vikings, clothing was a statement of who they were, where they came from, and what they could afford. However, for most Vikings, clothing was a much more practical affair. It was about survival and endurance, about creating garments that could withstand the harshness of winter and the challenges of life. Clothing wasn't a matter of luxury, it was a matter of necessity, and the Vikings approached it with the same level of skill and resourcefulness that they brought to everything else. The way Vikings used animal products in their clothing was also significant. They didn't just rely on wool or fur, they made use of every part of the animal. Leather, horns, and bones were all used to create tools, weapons, and clothing, demonstrating the Vikings' deep connection to the land and their respect for the animals they relied on. Every piece of clothing had a story, whether it was the cloak of a seasoned warrior, the boots of a seasoned explorer, or the tunic of a farmer braving the elements in search of food. These garments were more than just fabric. They were a testament to the Vikings' ingenuity, their connection to the land, and their ability to adapt to the harshest of environments. Thus, Viking clothing was a combination of necessity, practicality, and resourcefulness. Each garment was designed with purpose, to keep the body warm, to protect it from the cold, and to withstand the challenges of the environment. In a world where fire was often elusive and the cold seemed relentless, the Vikings' clothing innovations ensured that they had a fighting chance against the elements. By combining fur, wool, leather, and clever layering techniques, they were able to craft garments that not only kept them warm but also allowed them to thrive in a world that, without these innovations, would have swallowed them whole. In the heart of every Viking village stood the longhouse, a structure that was far more than just a home. It was the backbone of Viking life, a refuge from the unrelenting cold and the harsh elements that dominated their world. The longhouse was a place where survival met innovation, where design and function coexisted to create an environment that could withstand the brutal winter temperatures and provide shelter, warmth, and protection for the community. The longhouse was the center of Viking life, a communal space that housed entire families or even extended kin groups. It was typically constructed using timber, a resource readily available in the forests of Scandinavia. The frame of the longhouse was built from thick wooden beams, and the walls were often made of wattle and daub, a combination of woven branches and mud that provided insulation against the cold. The roof was typically thatched with reeds or grass, creating a tight seal to keep out the snow and rain. The structure was low and long, with a wide central hall running the length of the building, allowing multiple generations to live under the same roof, sharing warmth and resources. Inside, the layout of the longhouse was deceptively simple. The central hearth, often located in the middle of the building, was the heart of the home. It provided warmth, light, and a place to cook, and it was where families gathered to share meals, tell stories, and keep the dark winter nights at bay. The longhouse was designed in such a way that the heat from the fire could spread throughout the entire building, warming every person inside, no matter how far from the hearth they sat. The smoke from the fire would rise up through a central chimney, which often vented smoke into the roof, keeping the air inside breathable and allowing the warmth to linger. The walls of the longhouse were typically divided into separate spaces, each one designated for different tasks. One end of the longhouse would often be reserved for sleeping, with families bedding down on pallets or animal skins arranged along the floor. The other end might be used for storage or cooking, where food was preserved for the winter months. These spaces were not private in the modern sense. Rather, they were open and communal, allowing family members and guests to interact freely and work together. The close quarters encouraged cooperation, and the warmth of the hearth helped to create a sense of unity among those who shared the space. One of the most remarkable aspects of the longhouse was its ability to trap and retain heat. Viking builders understood the science of insulation long before modern engineers discovered its importance. The thick walls, the thatched roof, and the careful arrangement of the fire all worked together to create an environment that could stay warm even when the temperature outside plummeted to freezing or below. The Vikings, who were used to cold weather, understood that in such extreme conditions, the key to survival was to keep heat in and cold out. The longhouse was a symbol of Viking ingenuity and resourcefulness. In a world where every element of survival required careful planning and knowledge, the design of the longhouse reflected a deep understanding of how to use the natural environment to one's advantage. The materials used to build the house were all locally sourced, with wood from the nearby forests, straw from the fields, and earth from the ground. There was nothing superfluous in the construction of a longhouse. It was a functional, practical space, designed for maximum efficiency in an unforgiving climate. But the longhouse was not just about survival, it was also a symbol of the Viking way of life. The communal aspect of the longhouse was central to Viking society. In a world where resources were scarce and winter could stretch on for months, it was essential for families to come together and share what they had. The longhouse provided a space for socialization, for the exchange of stories, for the passing down of knowledge. Elders would sit by the fire and recount the tales of their ancestors, of gods and heroes, of voyages and battles. Children would listen intently, learning not only about their history but about the values that had shaped their people. This sense of community was reinforced by the layout of the longhouse itself. The design of the building encouraged interaction, with the central hearth acting as a gathering point for everyone inside. Unlike modern homes, where rooms are divided and separate, the Viking longhouse was open and shared, reflecting the importance of collective effort in the face of hardship. The warmth of the hearth brought people together, both physically and emotionally, as they endured the cold together and shared in the work of daily life. Viking longhouses were also designed to be practical in the face of constant danger. They were built to withstand the extreme weather conditions of the north, but they were also sturdy enough to withstand potential attacks. The longhouse was a fortified structure, with thick walls and small windows that were difficult for intruders to breach. The entrance was typically a low doorway, designed to make it harder for enemies to enter. The Vikings, who were often at war with neighboring tribes or kingdoms, understood the importance of security, and their homes reflected this concern. Despite the importance of the longhouse as a communal shelter, it was also a place of individual resilience. Each longhouse had its own personality, shaped by the people who lived in it. The walls might be adorned with tapestries or carvings that told the story of the family, or the space around the hearth might be decorated with symbols of protection or good fortune. Personal belongings, such as tools, weapons, and treasures, were kept in the longhouse, reflecting the individuality of the family or clan. But these possessions, like everything in Viking life, were seen as part of a larger whole. The longhouse was not just a personal space, it was a communal one, where the well-being of the family was tied to the well-being of the group. The longhouse also served as a place of protection. During times of conflict, the longhouse was where families would gather for safety, where warriors would prepare for battle or rest after a long day. The central hearth, which was a source of warmth, could also be a source of strength. In times of danger, the fire acted as a symbol of defiance, a reminder that the Vikings would endure, no matter how harsh the world around them became. For all its practicality, the longhouse was also a place of comfort. The fire, the warmth of the family, and the closeness of the space created an environment that was not just about survival but about the preservation of life and spirit. The longhouse was a refuge, not just from the cold, but from the hardships of the Viking world. It was a place where people came together to work, to eat, to sleep, and to find warmth, both physical and emotional. The Vikings knew that in a world where nature often seemed indifferent to human suffering, it was the warmth of family, the strength of the hearth, and the resilience of the longhouse that would see them through the darkest nights. In the Viking Age, survival through the long, cold winter months wasn't just about keeping warm, it was about ensuring that there would be enough food to sustain the community. The Viking world was a harsh one, where the seasons dictated the rhythms of life, and food wasn't something that could be easily obtained in the dead of winter. Without the proper preparation, the months of darkness and cold could turn deadly. Food preservation became a crucial skill that defined how well a Viking family or settlement would fare during the harshest times of the year. Winter was a time of scarcity, and the Vikings knew it. As the growing season came to an end, and the land was blanketed by snow, the lush, green fields of summer faded into memory. The rivers froze, making fishing nearly impossible, and the cold made hunting a challenge. With food harder to come by, the Vikings had to rely on the preservation methods they had honed over generations to ensure they wouldn't run out of provisions before spring arrived. These methods, some simple and others ingenious, allowed the Vikings to endure in one of the most inhospitable climates on Earth. One of the most important techniques the Vikings used for food preservation was drying. Meat, fish, and even fruits were dried to remove moisture, preventing bacteria and mold from spoiling the food. Drying was a process that could be done over several days or weeks, often with the use of fire or smoke. Fish, especially, was a critical part of the Viking diet, and drying it was essential to ensuring it would last through the winter. Smoked fish, such as herring and salmon, could be stored for months, providing the Vikings with a reliable source of protein during the long, lean months of winter. Similarly, meats like pork, beef, and venison were often salted or smoked to extend their shelf life. This method not only preserved the meat but also enhanced its flavor, making it a cherished part of the Viking diet. Large cuts of meat could be smoked over the fire, allowing the smoke to infuse the flesh with flavor while simultaneously preserving it. Salt, which the Vikings traded for from other cultures, played a vital role in the preservation process. Meat that was salted would keep much longer, lasting through the coldest months and ensuring that there would always be something to eat, even when fresh food was scarce. In addition to drying and salting, the Vikings also used fermentation to preserve food. This method, which involves the use of bacteria to convert sugars into acids, was used primarily for vegetables. One of the most common fermented foods in Viking homes was sauerkraut, made from cabbage that was shredded and left to ferment in brine. The fermentation process not only preserved the cabbage but also made it more nutritious, as it increased the levels of vitamins and beneficial bacteria. Other vegetables, such as carrots, turnips, and beets, could also be preserved in this way, providing much-needed nutrients during the winter months when fresh produce was scarce. The Vikings were also adept at preserving dairy products. Milk, cheese, and butter were staples in the Viking diet, and they were often preserved for long-term storage. Cheese could be made in large quantities during the summer and kept in cool, dry conditions through the winter months. Similarly, butter could be stored in tightly sealed containers, sometimes buried in the earth to keep it cool. Fermented dairy products, such as buttermilk and yogurt, were also common and provided important sources of protein and probiotics during the cold months. Perhaps one of the most ingenious methods of food preservation practiced by the Vikings was the creation of root cellars. These underground storage spaces were dug into the earth to take advantage of the ground's natural ability to stay cool and stable in temperature. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips were stored in these cellars, where they could stay fresh for months without freezing. In a world where refrigeration didn't exist, these root cellars were one of the most effective ways to keep food from spoiling. By utilizing the natural environment in this way, the Vikings ensured that they could store the bounty of the harvest and rely on it when the snow piled high and the winds howled. The Vikings also made use of honey, which was a natural preservative. Honey could be used to preserve fruits, herbs, and even some meats. Its high sugar content prevented the growth of bacteria and mold, and it was also valued for its sweetness and medicinal properties. Honey was often used to sweeten food and beverages, adding both flavor and a natural energy boost to the diet. It was also a prized commodity, traded across the Norse world, and was even used as a form of currency in some regions. Berries, herbs, and nuts were also important parts of the Viking diet, and many of them were preserved for the winter months. Berries, such as bilberries and lingonberries, were often picked in the late summer and preserved by drying or making jams and sauces. Herbs, such as dill and thyme, were dried and stored for flavoring dishes during the long winter. Nuts, which grew in abundance in some areas, were harvested in the fall and stored in cool, dry places to be eaten later. These preserved fruits, herbs, and nuts provided the Vikings with a wide variety of flavors and nutrients, helping to break the monotony of the winter diet. The preservation of food was not just about storing it for future consumption. It was a way of ensuring that the Vikings could maintain their strength and energy during the harsh winter months. The Vikings were not just surviving the winter, they were thriving in it, using their knowledge of preservation to create a diverse and nutritious diet that could sustain them through the coldest months. Their methods were not only practical but also a reflection of their deep connection to the land, as they learned to work with nature to preserve what it provided. During the long winter nights, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, the Vikings would gather around the table, enjoying the fruits of their labor. The food they ate was more than just sustenance. It was a testament to their ingenuity, their understanding of the land, and their ability to adapt to the harsh conditions they faced. In a world where the difference between life and death could come down to a single meal, the Vikings' ability to preserve food was one of their greatest strengths. It was a skill that allowed them to endure the most difficult seasons, ensuring that they would be able to celebrate the arrival of spring with strength and vitality, ready for the challenges that lay ahead. In a world where every day was a battle against the harsh elements, the Vikings' mastery of tools and technology was crucial to their survival. Their ability to craft effective weapons, tools, and everyday items was not only a testament to their ingenuity but also to their understanding of the materials around them and how to use them to their advantage. The Vikings didn't just survive, they thrived, making use of what the land provided and transforming it into the means of sustaining life in an unforgiving climate. One of the key aspects of Viking technology was their craftsmanship. From the forging of iron to the weaving of textiles, Viking tools and products were created with remarkable skill and precision. Every tool had a specific purpose, and the craftsmanship involved was often the difference between success and failure. The Viking blacksmith, for example, was a figure of great importance in Viking society. These skilled craftsmen used fire, iron, and anvil to create everything from weapons to farming tools, each item forged with the understanding that it would have to endure the demanding conditions of the northern environment. Iron was one of the most important materials for the Vikings, and they were adept at extracting and forging it into a wide range of tools. The Vikings had access to rich iron deposits found in their lands, and they used primitive but effective methods to smelt the iron from the earth. Once smelted, the iron was used to make everything from swords and axes to plows and nails. Viking axes, in particular, were famous for their durability and effectiveness, and they were not only used in battle but also as versatile tools for felling trees, building homes, and clearing land. The Viking axe was a multi-purpose tool, allowing the Vikings to shape their world both in terms of survival and expansion. Weapons, too, were crafted with precision. Viking swords were highly prized, with their distinctive curved blades and intricate designs. The process of forging a sword was complex, involving the careful layering of iron and steel to create a blade that was both sharp and strong. The craftsmanship behind these swords was highly valued, as they were not just tools of war, but symbols of status and power. A finely crafted sword could be passed down through generations, becoming a family heirloom, a symbol of honor and strength. However, not all Viking tools were meant for battle. The Vikings were also skilled in crafting everyday items that were essential for their survival. Their farming tools, for example, were designed to maximize efficiency in an environment where growing seasons were short and the land could be unforgiving. Viking plows, sickles, and spades were crafted to cut through the tough northern soil, allowing them to cultivate crops and sustain their communities. These tools, though simple in design, were effective and durable, crafted to withstand the harsh conditions of the Scandinavian landscape. In addition to farming tools, the Vikings were also skilled at crafting items for their homes and daily life. Wooden tools were essential in a world where timber was abundant and the need for shelter and warmth was constant. The Vikings crafted furniture, storage chests, and even intricate carvings for their longhouses, all made from wood. These items were not merely functional but also imbued with cultural significance. Carvings and designs were often incorporated into the furniture and buildings, depicting scenes from Viking mythology, legends, and everyday life. These decorative elements not only enhanced the aesthetic of their homes but also reflected the Vikings' deep connection to their culture and beliefs. Textiles were another area where Viking craftsmanship shone. Viking women, in particular, were skilled weavers, creating textiles from wool, linen, and other fibers. They spun the fibers into yarn, which was then woven into fabric that could be used for clothing, blankets, and sails. Wool was the primary material for clothing, but linen was also used, especially for undergarments and finer garments. The weaving process was time-consuming and required great skill, as the weavers had to create textiles that were both durable and functional. Clothing was not just a necessity, it was also an expression of Viking identity. The patterns and colors used in Viking clothing could indicate a person's status, wealth, or clan affiliation. The Viking longship, perhaps one of the most famous examples of Viking technology, was a testament to their ingenuity and craftsmanship. These ships were designed for both speed and durability, allowing the Vikings to travel long distances across the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. The longships were made of oak, which was flexible yet strong enough to withstand the rough seas. The Vikings also understood the importance of symmetry and balance, and their ships were designed to be both agile and capable of carrying heavy loads. The longships were not only military vessels but also tools of exploration, trade, and migration. Their design allowed the Vikings to reach as far as North America, centuries before other European powers, and their technology helped to establish Viking influence in places like England, France, and even parts of the Mediterranean. The Vikings' technological prowess was not limited to crafting tools and weapons. They also developed advanced techniques for navigation. Using the stars, the sun, and natural landmarks, they were able to navigate the open sea with remarkable precision. The Viking navigators, or sailors, were skilled at reading the sky and the sea, using the position of the sun to determine their course. In addition, the Vikings created the sunstone, a type of crystal that helped them navigate even on cloudy days. The sunstone allowed them to find the direction of the sun, even when it was obscured by clouds or fog. This innovation made long-distance voyages possible, enabling the Vikings to explore, trade, and raid far beyond their homeland. The use of fire, as discussed earlier, was also a critical technology for the Vikings. Not only did they rely on fire for warmth and cooking, but they also used it in their metalworking processes. The forge, where iron and steel were heated to extreme temperatures, was the heart of Viking blacksmithing. Fire was the tool that allowed them to shape and harden metals, creating swords, axes, and other essential items. In this way, fire wasn't just a source of warmth, it was an essential part of the Vikings' technological world, enabling them to craft the tools that would define their civilization. Viking technology, though often simple by modern standards, was a key factor in their success as warriors, traders, and settlers. The tools and weapons they crafted were designed for efficiency, durability, and versatility. They understood the materials at their disposal and knew how to use them to their advantage. The Vikings' technological expertise allowed them to conquer new lands, explore distant shores, and create a thriving society in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Their ability to craft, innovate, and adapt to their surroundings was not only a testament to their skill but also to their resilience and ingenuity, qualities that would define the Viking Age for centuries to come. In the harsh, unforgiving world of the Viking Age, survival depended not only on individual ingenuity but also on the strength and cooperation of the community. The Vikings, despite their reputation as fierce warriors and explorers, were deeply social people who understood the importance of structure and organization. Their social systems were designed not just to protect their way of life but to ensure the continued prosperity of their communities, especially during the long, brutal winters when food was scarce and the outside world could feel like an inhospitable wilderness. At the heart of Viking society was the family. It was the basic unit of Viking life, but it was not a small, isolated unit as we might think of today. The family was extended, often encompassing multiple generations living in the same household or longhouse. This sense of extended family created a strong sense of mutual support and responsibility. The older generations, including grandparents and great-grandparents, had a vital role to play in maintaining the knowledge and traditions that were passed down through the ages. They were the bearers of stories, history, and wisdom, and their influence shaped the moral and cultural framework of the community. Children, too, were not just immediate dependents but were seen as future contributors to the family's survival, learning skills from an early age that would allow them to contribute to the family's economy and defenses. This extended family structure helped the Vikings endure the difficulties of daily life. Whether in a small farmstead or a larger settlement, the family worked together to gather food, maintain the home, care for animals, and perform the various tasks necessary for survival. This communal approach to work meant that every member of the family had a role, and their combined efforts ensured that the household remained functional and prepared for the challenges of the harsh seasons. Even children were expected to contribute, by tending livestock, helping with chores, or learning trades and crafts that they would one day pass down to their own children. In a world where resources were scarce, it was the family's cooperation and division of labor that kept the longhouse warm, the food stores full, and the community strong. However, the Viking social structure extended beyond the immediate family. Larger groups of families formed clans or tribes, with each clan operating as a tight-knit community. These clans were bound together by blood ties and shared history, and they provided a network of support during times of need. It was not uncommon for Viking families to form alliances with other clans, creating larger networks of solidarity. These alliances were crucial in times of war or famine, as they allowed for mutual defense, the pooling of resources, and the sharing of knowledge. The leadership of these clans was often entrusted to a chief or jarl, a powerful figure who oversaw the welfare of the clan. Chiefs were typically chosen based on their strength, wisdom, and ability to lead in battle or in times of peace. They were expected to protect their people, provide for their needs, and guide them through difficult times. In return for their leadership, chiefs were often given a portion of the spoils from raids or successful hunts, as well as gifts from the people they led. The jarl was more than just a political figure. They were seen as the protector of their people, and their authority was rooted in both their ability to lead and the respect they commanded from their followers. The Viking society was also divided into distinct social classes. At the top of the hierarchy was the noble class, which consisted of the jarls and their families. These individuals held the most power, land, and influence, and they were often the ones who led raids or organized trade expeditions. Beneath them was the free class, made up of farmers, merchants, artisans, and warriors. These individuals were free people who owned land or businesses, but they were not as wealthy or powerful as the jarls. They played a crucial role in the day-to-day functioning of Viking society, providing the goods and services necessary for the community's survival. At the bottom of the social structure were the thralls, the enslaved people who worked the land and performed menial labor. Thralls were typically captured during raids or born into slavery, and they had few rights or freedoms. They were considered property and could be bought and sold, often performing the hardest, most labor-intensive tasks in Viking society. However, while their lives were undoubtedly hard, Thralls could sometimes earn their freedom through exceptional service or by purchasing it, though this was a rare occurrence. Despite their low status, thralls played an essential role in maintaining the social and economic fabric of Viking society, performing tasks that freed people were too busy to carry out. Viking society was not static, though, and its structures could be fluid. Social mobility, while limited, was possible. A skilled warrior, for example, could gain enough wealth and prestige to rise to the rank of jarl. Similarly, a talented artisan or merchant could accumulate enough wealth to join the ranks of the free people. This fluidity within the social structure helped create a sense of opportunity and possibility, and it allowed the Viking world to remain dynamic, always evolving in response to internal and external pressures. While social status was important, Viking society also valued personal reputation and honor. Much of the social structure revolved around the concept of heir, honor, and a person's reputation was often considered more important than wealth or status. This is why the Vikings were so focused on ensuring that they maintained their honor through their actions, especially in battle. A warrior's reputation, for instance, was shaped by their bravery, their loyalty, and their ability to fight. A man who earned a reputation as a great warrior could gain a place in Viking sagas and be remembered for generations. Even those who were not warriors could achieve honor through skill, wisdom, or leadership. Thus, Viking society was one where individual actions could shape not only a person's social standing but also their legacy. The concept of loyalty was also deeply embedded in Viking society. Loyalty to one's family, clan, and chief was paramount, and betrayal was one of the worst offenses. The Vikings placed a strong emphasis on kinship bonds, and breaking these bonds could result in disgrace and exile. This loyalty was not blind, however, it was reciprocal. Chiefs and jarls were expected to care for their people, to share the spoils of war, and to protect the weak. In return, the people were expected to support their leaders and fight for the survival of their clan. One of the most important elements of Viking social structure was their communal approach to decision-making. Vikings practiced a form of democracy at the local level through a gathering known as the Thing. The Thing was a legal assembly where free men gathered to make decisions about important matters, including disputes, laws, and alliances. While the Thing did not have the power to override a chief's authority, it played a crucial role in maintaining social cohesion and ensuring that every voice could be heard. The Thing was a reflection of the Vikings' commitment to consensus building, and it helped to strengthen the bonds between the people and their leaders. Viking society, with its complex layers of family, clan, and class, was a society built for survival. Every aspect of Viking life, from the smallest family unit to the grandest Jarl's Hall, was designed to ensure that the community could endure and thrive in the face of adversity. Their social structures allowed them to withstand the pressures of war, famine, and harsh winters, creating a cohesive and resilient culture that would leave an indelible mark on history. Whether in the bustle of the market, the quiet of the longhouse, or the heat of battle, the Vikings were bound together by a shared sense of purpose, honor, and survival. In the Viking Age, the diet of the people was deeply intertwined with their environment, shaped by both necessity and the demands of survival in the harsh, cold climes of Scandinavia. Unlike today, where we have easy access to a wide variety of food year-round, the Vikings had to carefully plan and prepare for the long, bitter winters, when the land lay dormant under snow, and fresh food was nearly impossible to find. Every aspect of the Viking diet was carefully considered, from the preservation of meat and fish to the cultivation of crops that could withstand the cold. The food they ate was not only sustenance, it was a key factor in their resilience, their ability to endure the brutal winters and thrive in a world where every meal could be a battle for survival. The Viking diet was based primarily on what could be grown, hunted, fished, and preserved within the short, intense growing seasons of the north. Grains like barley, oats, and rye were staples of the Viking diet, providing the carbohydrates necessary for energy in the face of grueling physical labor. These grains were used to make bread, porridge, and beer, and they formed the foundation of many meals. Oats, in particular, were a favored grain, as they could grow in the rocky, nutrient-poor soil of Scandinavia and provided a reliable source of food even in the most unforgiving conditions. Bread was a common food item in the Viking diet, though it was very different from the modern loaves we think of today. Viking bread was dense and hearty, made from ground barley or rye, and often cooked over an open flame or baked in a stone oven. It was not as refined as today's bread, and it lacked the airiness we associate with modern loaves. Instead, it was a dense, hearty food that would sustain the Vikings through long days of hard work, whether they were out in the fields, working in the forge, or raiding distant shores. Bread was often eaten with butter, cheese, or preserved meats, providing a filling, satisfying meal for the hard-working Norse people. Porridge was another mainstay of the Viking diet. Made from oats or barley, this simple dish could be eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. The porridge would be made with water or milk, and often sweetened with honey or berries when available. In times of scarcity, porridge could be made from the scraps left over from other meals, making it a versatile and cost-effective way to stretch limited resources. For the Vikings, porridge was both a comfort and a necessity, offering warmth and sustenance during the cold winter months. Meat, particularly from domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, and pigs, was an essential part of the Viking diet. While the Vikings hunted wild game, including deer, elk, and reindeer, the bulk of their meat came from animals they raised themselves. Pigs were especially valuable as they could be raised for their meat, and their fat could be used for cooking or preserving other foods. Pork, especially salted and smoked, was a common food, providing a reliable source of protein during the lean winter months. Sheep were another important source of meat, with lamb and mutton forming a key part of the Viking diet. The Vikings also raised cattle, though cattle were more valuable for their milk and hides than for their meat, which was often reserved for special occasions or feasts. Fish was an equally important component of the Viking diet, and living in close proximity to the sea meant that seafood was readily available. Fish such as herring, cod, and salmon were staples in the Viking diet. These fish were often salted or dried to preserve them for long periods, ensuring that they would be available when fresh fish was not accessible. Dried and salted fish, particularly herring, was a vital food source during the long winter months, when fresh food was scarce. Fish was often served with bread, porridge, or vegetables, creating a balanced and nutritious meal that could be eaten by the whole family. Dairy products were also integral to the Viking diet. Milk from cows and goats was a key part of their nutrition, and it was used to make butter, cheese, and yogurt. Viking cheese was often made from cow or goat milk and could be stored for long periods, providing a reliable source of protein and fat during the winter months. Butter was another staple in Viking homes, often used to cook food or spread on bread. The Vikings even used butter as a way to preserve meat, rubbing it into cuts of meat before storing them, which helped to keep the meat fresh. Vegetables, though less abundant in the Viking world, were still an important part of the diet. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were common, as they could grow in the cold northern soil and were relatively easy to store through the winter months. These vegetables were often cooked into stews or soups, providing much-needed nutrients and variety to the Viking diet. The Vikings also grew cabbage, which was often fermented into sauerkraut, a highly nutritious food that could be preserved for months. This fermentation process not only preserved the cabbage but also provided beneficial bacteria for digestion, making it an important part of the Viking diet during the cold, lean months of winter. Berries and fruits were another crucial part of the Viking diet, though they were primarily available in the summer and fall. Berries like bilberries, lingonberries, and cloudberries were gathered in the wild, and when they were in season, they were eaten fresh or preserved through drying or fermentation. The Vikings also grew apples and pears, though these fruits were not as common as berries. Fruits were typically eaten in the summer, when they were fresh, or stored for later use in jams and preserves. These fruits added a touch of sweetness to the Viking diet, providing a break from the hearty, savory foods that made up most of their meals. Honey was one of the few natural sweeteners available to the Vikings. It was prized not only for its sweetness but also for its medicinal properties. Honey was often used to sweeten porridge or baked goods, and it was also fermented to make mead, a popular alcoholic beverage among the Vikings. Mead, made from honey, water, and sometimes fruit or herbs, was consumed during feasts and celebrations, and it played an important role in Viking social life. While the Viking diet was primarily composed of simple, hearty foods, it was a reflection of the people's resourcefulness and adaptability. The Vikings did not waste any part of what they could grow, hunt, or fish. Every food item had a purpose, and every meal was designed to nourish the body and provide the energy necessary to survive in a world where harsh winters, scarcity, and danger were constant threats. The Vikings understood the importance of preserving food, of making sure that they had enough to last through the lean months. Their diet, like their social structures and tools, was not just about survival. It was about thriving in an environment that would have crushed lesser people. Their ability to make the most of what they had, to stretch every meal and utilize every resource, was a testament to their ingenuity and resilience. Viking clothing was not just a matter of personal style or fashion. It was a necessity, carefully crafted and adapted to survive the brutal conditions of the North. In a world where the cold was ever-present and the seasons could be harsh and unforgiving, the Vikings needed clothing that would keep them warm, dry, and protected from the elements. Their clothing was both practical and ingenious, designed with the resources available to them and the knowledge passed down through generations. The Vikings' understanding of their environment and their ability to adapt their clothing to the changing seasons were vital aspects of their survival. The Viking wardrobe was primarily made from wool, linen, and animal hides, all materials that were readily available to them. Wool, in particular, was the most important fabric, as it provided warmth, durability, and flexibility. Sheep were a major part of Viking life, and their wool was a valuable resource. The Vikings would shear the sheep during the spring, spinning the wool into yarn to make fabrics for clothing. Wool was ideal for the cold northern climate because it could trap air between its fibers, providing an insulating layer that kept the body warm even in damp conditions. In addition, wool has natural moisture-wicking properties, which allowed it to keep the skin dry even in the rain or snow, an essential quality for surviving the often wet and unpredictable Viking winters. The process of creating woolen fabric was labor-intensive. Women, who were primarily responsible for domestic tasks, would spin wool into yarn using a spindle, and then weave the yarn into cloth using a loom. The quality of the fabric could vary depending on the skill of the weaver, but even the most basic woolen garments were effective at keeping the cold at bay. The Vikings didn't just use wool for clothing, they also made blankets, rugs, and even sails for their ships out of it. Wool was a versatile material, and the Vikings took full advantage of its insulating and durable qualities. While wool was the primary material for warmth, linen also had a place in Viking clothing, particularly for undergarments and lighter garments worn during the milder seasons. Linen was made from flax, another plant that the Vikings cultivated. The fibers were spun into yarn and woven into fabric, which was then used to create shirts, tunics, and undergarments. Linen was lighter and more breathable than wool, making it ideal for wear during the spring and summer months. It also helped wick away moisture from the skin, keeping the body cool when temperatures rose. Linen was often used as a base layer, worn beneath woolen tunics and dresses, as it provided a comfortable, soft fabric against the skin. The Vikings were also skilled at tanning animal hides to make leather and fur garments. Leather was used for a variety of purposes, including boots, belts, gloves, and protective clothing for work or combat. Fur, on the other hand, was used to line clothing or as outer garments to provide additional insulation against the cold. The Vikings hunted a variety of animals, including deer, wolves, and bears, whose pelts provided valuable material for clothing. Furs were particularly useful for making cloaks, hoods, and capes that would shield the wearer from the biting winds and freezing temperatures. The use of fur was a symbol of wealth and status, as it was a material that required effort and skill to obtain, and it was often used by Viking chieftains and warriors to display their prestige. Viking clothing was also designed with practicality and mobility in mind. Whether they were farming, raiding, or sailing, the Vikings needed garments that would allow them to move freely and comfortably. Tunics and dresses were typically loose-fitting, providing flexibility for working or fighting. For men, the basic outfit consisted of a woolen tunic, a belt to hold up the tunic, and trousers or leggings made from wool or leather. Women wore long dresses, often made from wool, with a belt at the waist to help cinch the fabric. The tunics and dresses were typically knee-length or longer, providing warmth and coverage while allowing ease of movement. For both men and women, the Vikings wore cloaks made of wool or fur, fastened with brooches at the shoulders. These cloaks were essential for warmth, especially during the long, dark winters when the days were short and the cold was biting. The cloak could be worn over the shoulders like a blanket, providing an additional layer of insulation. The brooches used to fasten the cloaks were often decorative, featuring intricate designs that reflected the craftsmanship and artistry of the Viking people. These brooches were not only functional but also served as a symbol of the wearer's status, with larger, more ornate brooches often indicating a higher rank in society. In addition to cloaks, the Vikings also wore hats and hoods, which were important for protecting the head and face from the cold. A typical Viking hat was made from wool or leather, and it could be a simple cap or a more elaborate, fur-lined hood. The hoods were especially useful for shielding the face from wind and snow, which were common hazards in the Viking world. Vikings who spent a great deal of time outdoors, such as hunters or sailors, would often wear fur-lined hoods or capes to protect themselves from the elements. Footwear was another essential part of Viking clothing. The Vikings wore sturdy boots made from leather, which were ideal for walking long distances, working in the fields, or wading through snow and mud. The boots were typically knee-high or calf-high, providing protection against the cold ground and the rough terrain. Leather was also used to make sandals, which were worn in the warmer months, although sandals were less common in northern regions where the cold persisted year-round. Boots, however, were an absolute necessity for survival during the long winters, when snow, ice, and mud could make travel difficult. Viking clothing, while designed for warmth and practicality, also displayed a sense of individuality and personal style. While the basic garments were often similar across the population, the Vikings were skilled artisans who adorned their clothing with decorative elements. Embroidered patterns, particularly on sleeves and hems, were common, and the quality and complexity of the embroidery could reflect a person's wealth or social status. The Vikings also used jewelry, such as necklaces, rings, and brooches, to personalize their clothing and display their status. These items were often made from silver or bronze, and many were engraved with intricate designs or symbols of Viking culture, such as the Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, or the wolf, which represented strength and protection. The Vikings' clothing was designed to be both functional and beautiful. It was not just about survival, it was about expression, identity, and practicality in equal measure. Clothing was a reflection of the Viking way of life, a life that required strength, adaptability, and resourcefulness. Every stitch, every woven thread, was a testament to their skill and their understanding of the world around them. The Vikings knew that to survive the cold, to endure the challenges of their environment, they had to wear clothing that would shield them from the elements while allowing them to move freely and efficiently. Their clothing was not just a shield from the cold, it was a part of who they were, a symbol of their culture, their resilience, and their ability to adapt to the world they had conquered. The Vikings are often remembered for their fierce raids and unrelenting battles, and for good reason. Viking warfare was not just about conquering lands, it was about a deep-rooted warrior culture that defined the people of the North. Warfare permeated every aspect of Viking life, and their strategies, weapons, and values surrounding combat were as sophisticated as they were brutal. In the Viking world, a man's honor was tied to his prowess in battle, and the spoils of war, whether they were lands, riches, or renown, were what ensured survival and prosperity for families, clans, and kingdoms alike. Warfare was not just a means of survival but a way of life. The Vikings' warrior culture was built on the idea of honor, loyalty, and the pursuit of glory. The concept of honor was paramount. A Viking's reputation was shaped by how well they fought, how loyal they were to their comrades, and how they upheld their word in battle. A warrior's status was earned through skill and bravery, not through birthright or wealth. Young Vikings were trained from an early age to fight, whether it was with a sword, axe, or spear. Combat was not just about physical strength, it was about strategy, understanding the terrain, and knowing how to fight as part of a team. From a young age, Viking children were taught the art of warfare, and many grew up with the dream of proving their mettle on the battlefield. One of the key elements of Viking warfare was the use of the berserker. The berserkers were elite warriors who were said to fight in a trance-like fury, often described as invulnerable in battle. They were believed to have been imbued with the spirit of the bear or wolf, gaining their ferocity from the animal's primal strength. The berserkers were feared and revered in Viking society, and their role was integral to Viking raids and battles. Legends tell of berserkers howling and charging into battle without fear, often in the front lines, overwhelming enemies with their strength and savagery. Whether or not the berserkers' legendary frenzy was a result of hallucinogenic substances or psychological warfare is unclear, but what is certain is that they were a key component of Viking military success. The Vikings' weapons were designed for both effectiveness and durability. The axe, particularly the Viking axe, became the signature weapon of Viking warriors. The Viking axe was often a broad-bladed, single-headed axe, with a long handle that allowed for powerful, cleaving strikes. It was a versatile weapon, capable of dealing devastating blows in both close combat and during raids. The axe was also used for other tasks, such as felling trees and building ships, but in the hands of a Viking warrior, it was a symbol of power and skill. Axes were not just tools of war, they were tools of the Viking way of life, used in every aspect of their existence. In addition to the axe, Viking warriors wielded swords, spears, and shields. Viking swords were typically one-handed weapons, with a curved blade that was designed for cutting and thrusting. The swords were often highly decorated, and many were passed down through generations, becoming family heirlooms. The Vikings believed that a sword's strength was tied to its craftsmanship, and it was common for a warrior to be remembered not just for his feats in battle but for the quality of the weapons he wielded. Spears, too, were a common weapon, particularly for throwing. They were simple but effective, and the Vikings used them in battle formations that allowed them to overwhelm enemies with numbers and precision. Shields were an essential part of the Viking warrior's gear. Typically round, made of wood, and reinforced with iron, the Viking shield was designed for both offense and defense. Shields were used not only to protect the warrior but also as a weapon in itself. During battle, the shields were often locked together, forming a shield wall that created a solid, impenetrable line. This tactic was key to Viking military success, as it allowed them to defend themselves while slowly advancing and wearing down their enemies. The shield wall was a hallmark of Viking battle strategy, a display of unity, discipline, and the strength of numbers. Viking warfare was not just about brute force. It was also about strategy and planning. The Vikings were expert tacticians who understood the importance of knowing their environment, reading the battlefield, and using their mobility to their advantage. The Vikings relied on surprise and speed to catch their enemies off guard. Their longships, which were light and fast, allowed them to launch surprise raids on coastal towns and villages. The Vikings could appear out of nowhere, strike with ferocity, and disappear before their enemies even had time to react. This made the Vikings fearsome opponents and gave them a reputation for being unpredictable and ruthless. In addition to their naval prowess, the Vikings were skilled at land warfare. They often used ambushes and hit-and-run tactics, attacking their enemies with speed and precision before retreating into the forest or mountains. They were also adept at siege warfare, using a combination of battering rams, fire, and other methods to break down the defenses of enemy fortifications. The Vikings understood the importance of psychological warfare, often spreading fear and terror among their enemies before even engaging in combat. They would burn villages, pillage towns, and destroy anything of value, sending a clear message to any who dared oppose them. The Vikings' raids were often seen as an extension of their warrior culture. They did not raid simply for loot, they raided for honor and glory. The spoils of war were important, but the true prize was the reputation earned from successful raids. Viking warriors who had proven their worth in battle were often given titles and lands, and their deeds were celebrated in songs and sagas. These sagas, passed down through generations, immortalized the warriors' names, ensuring that their bravery would be remembered long after they were gone. A Viking who returned from a successful raid would be honored as a hero, his name sung by skalds, poets, his deeds etched into the collective memory of Viking society. However, the Viking concept of war was not only about fighting and conquering. The Vikings also engaged in trade, diplomacy, and alliances to further their goals. Many Viking warriors became mercenaries, fighting for wealth and status in foreign lands. The Vikings traveled widely, from the British Isles to the Mediterranean, and even to the far reaches of the East, where they formed trading networks and political alliances. These connections allowed the Vikings to acquire new weapons, resources, and knowledge, which in turn made them even more formidable warriors. Viking warfare was also deeply tied to their beliefs. The Vikings were a pagan people, and their gods were central to their worldview. In battle, they believed that the gods watched over them, rewarding those who fought bravely with a place in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. For the Vikings, dying in battle was not a tragedy but a path to eternal glory. This belief fueled their fearlessness in combat, as warriors sought to die in battle to earn their place in the afterlife. The gods of Norse mythology, including Odin, Thor, and Freya, were not just figures of worship, they were symbols of strength, courage, and battle prowess. A Viking warrior who fought bravely in life could hope to join the gods in death, an aspiration that made their warfare all the more sacred and meaningful. In conclusion, Viking warfare was more than just a means of conquest, it was a way of life, a vital part of their identity and culture. From their weapons and tactics to their fierce belief in honor and glory, the Vikings were a people shaped by their warrior culture. Their raids, battles, and conquests are remembered to this day, not just for the wealth they accumulated but for the indelible mark they left on the world. Viking warriors were not simply fighters, they were heroes, legends, and symbols of a culture that thrived on the edge of battle. The Viking warrior spirit continues to captivate our imagination, a testament to a people who lived and died with honor, valor, and an unyielding will to survive. The Vikings are often celebrated for their raids and conquests, but they were also some of history's most remarkable explorers. Their voyages were not limited to warfare and pillaging, they were driven by a thirst for discovery, adventure, and the desire to expand their horizons. The Viking spirit of exploration was fueled by the same qualities that made them such formidable warriors: courage, resilience, and an unyielding desire to explore the unknown. Over the centuries, they traveled farther than any other European people of their time, reaching lands as distant as North America, the Mediterranean, and the farthest reaches of Russia. The Vikings didn't just conquer, they explored, traded, and left their mark on history in ways that few could imagine. The Vikings' exploration began with their mastery of the seas. Their longships, the iconic vessels that became the symbol of Viking maritime prowess, were revolutionary for their time. These ships were designed for speed, agility, and versatility. Unlike the bulky, slow ships used by other cultures, the Viking longship could sail not only on open seas but also navigate shallow rivers and estuaries. This made them perfect for raiding, but it also allowed the Vikings to explore new territories. The ships were sleek, lightweight, and could be rowed or sailed, depending on the conditions. Their shallow draft meant they could be quickly launched from the shore, making them ideal for surprise raids or expeditions. The longships allowed the Vikings to reach places that others could only dream of, from the icy shores of Iceland to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. Viking exploration was not just about warfare, it was also about discovery and trade. The Vikings were keenly aware of the value of expanding their trade networks, and many of their voyages were motivated by the desire to establish new trading routes. In their longships, they sailed down rivers in Eastern Europe, reaching the Byzantine Empire and beyond, where they traded furs, amber, and slaves for silver, silk, and other luxury goods. The Vikings established important trade hubs, from the bustling streets of Constantinople to the markets of the Arabian world. Their voyages were not just about plundering, but about creating lasting economic and cultural ties that would shape the medieval world for centuries to come. One of the most remarkable aspects of Viking exploration was their journey westward, across the Atlantic Ocean, to North America. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, a Norse explorer from Iceland, became the first known European to set foot in North America, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Eriksson's voyage took him to a place he called Vinland, which is believed to be located in what is now Newfoundland in Canada. The Norse settlers in Vinland established a small settlement, the remains of which have been uncovered by archaeologists. The story of Leif Erikson and the Vikings' brief foray into North America is a testament to their extraordinary navigational skills and their willingness to explore unknown lands. The Vikings' exploration of the North Atlantic was not a one-time event but part of a broader movement of expansion. After the initial settlement in Greenland, the Vikings began to establish colonies in Iceland and the Faroe Islands, all of which played a key role in Viking exploration. Iceland, in particular, became a crucial base for further exploration. From there, the Vikings sailed to Greenland and beyond, hoping to find new lands that would offer fertile soil and resources for settlement. Greenland itself, named for its surprisingly green and fertile coastal regions, became a Viking stronghold, with settlers establishing farms and thriving communities. These voyages into the icy northern expanses were dangerous and required great skill and courage. The Vikings navigated by the stars, the sun, and landmarks, relying on their knowledge of the natural world to guide them through the vast, featureless sea. The Vikings were not just explorers by sea, but by land as well. The vast lands of Russia, the steppe regions of Eastern Europe, and even the distant realms of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world were within the reach of Viking traders and explorers. Their extensive trade routes through Russia, which led to Constantinople, the Volga River, and the Caspian Sea, were crucial to the Viking economy and expanded their knowledge of the world. These routes also allowed the Vikings to interact with a wide variety of cultures, from the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe to the Arabs and Byzantines. In many ways, the Viking expansion helped to link disparate parts of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, creating a shared economic and cultural exchange that would have long-lasting effects. The Vikings also explored and settled in parts of the Mediterranean, particularly in Sicily and southern Italy, as well as North Africa. Their encounters with these civilizations introduced them to new ideas, technologies, and goods, which they brought back to Scandinavia. The Vikings' presence in the Mediterranean was short-lived, but it was a part of a larger pattern of Viking exploration, which was not limited by the known world. They were as comfortable sailing to the remote shores of Greenland as they were trading along the coasts of Spain and North Africa. Their willingness to explore distant lands, often without any knowledge of what they would find, reflects the bold, adventurous spirit that defined the Viking Age. In addition to their skills in exploration, the Vikings were also adept at settlement and adaptation. When they arrived in new lands, they did not just pillage and leave, they established lasting communities, learning to live in the environment and adapt to its challenges. The Viking settlements in Greenland, Iceland, and North America were marked by the Vikings' ability to create thriving agricultural societies despite the harsh climates they encountered. In Greenland, the Vikings raised cattle, grew barley, and developed trade networks with the native Inuit people. In Iceland, they created a unique society based on the Norse legal system and the Althing, one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. These settlements were not just military outposts but complex communities built by people who were determined to carve out a life in the wilderness. What makes the Vikings' exploration so remarkable is the fact that they did it with relatively primitive tools and technologies. They had no compass, no maps, and no understanding of the continents they were discovering. They navigated using the stars, the sun's position, landmarks, and the changing winds and tides. Viking seafaring technology, particularly the design of their longships, was so advanced for its time that it enabled them to undertake voyages that other cultures could not have managed. It was through their sheer ingenuity and determination that they were able to chart new lands and open up trade routes that would connect Europe to Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Despite their incredible achievements, Viking exploration is often overshadowed by their raids and military exploits. However, their voyages were just as important in shaping the world of the medieval period. The Vikings helped to expand the boundaries of the known world, and their legacy as explorers is just as significant as their reputation as warriors. Their ability to explore, trade, and settle in distant lands laid the foundation for the global networks of trade and communication that would follow in the centuries to come. In the end, the Viking Age was not just a time of conflict and conquest, it was a time of exploration and discovery. The Vikings left an indelible mark on the world, not only through their raids but through their voyages that opened up new lands and connected distant cultures. They were not simply conquerors, They were adventurers, traders, and pioneers who shaped the course of history through their exploration of the world. The Viking Age, which spanned roughly from the late 8th century to the 11th century, may have officially come to an end with the conquest of the last Viking strongholds and the Christianization of Scandinavia, but the legacy of the Vikings is far from finished. Far beyond their raids and conquests, the Vikings left an indelible mark on the cultures, economies, and societies they touched. Their influence can be seen in everything from the languages spoken in Northern Europe to the modern ideals of exploration, trade, and maritime engineering. The Vikings were not just conquerors. They were creators, merchants, innovators, and visionaries whose impact resonates even today, over 1,000 years later. One of the most lasting legacies of the Vikings is their influence on language. The Old Norse language, which was spoken by the Vikings, has left a profound imprint on the modern languages of Scandinavia, but it also influenced English. When the Vikings settled in parts of what is now England, their language became deeply intertwined with Old English. Many common English words, especially those related to law, governance, and everyday life, have their origins in Old Norse. Words like sky, window, egg, and husband are direct borrowings from Old Norse. Additionally, many place names in the British Isles, particularly in areas once ruled by the Vikings, still carry traces of Norse heritage, with names ending in by, meaning village, thorp, meaning farm, and wick, meaning town or settlement. The Vikings' linguistic legacy helped shape the modern languages of Europe, and their influence on English is still visible in the vocabulary we use today. Beyond language, the Vikings also left a mark on the legal and political structures of the lands they inhabited. The Vikings had a sophisticated system of governance, which was reflected in their unique assembly known as the Thing. The Thing was a gathering of free men, often held at a designated place, where decisions were made collectively. It was here that laws were discussed, disputes were settled, and leaders were chosen. The Vikings believed in the power of the community to govern itself, and their democratic approach to decision-making would influence the development of more formalized legal systems in the centuries to come. The concept of a thing or assembly was particularly important in the early formation of legal systems in Iceland, where the Alþingi, the world's oldest parliamentary institution, was established in 930 AD. This system of law and governance, with its roots in Viking society, would lay the foundation for modern democratic institutions. The Vikings also contributed significantly to the development of maritime technology. Their longships, renowned for their speed, versatility, and ability to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, were revolutionary for their time. These ships allowed the Vikings to travel vast distances, from the shores of North America to the Mediterranean. The design of the longship influenced naval architecture for centuries, and many of the principles behind Viking shipbuilding would later be adopted by other seafaring cultures. The Vikings' ability to sail across the seas with precision and efficiency enabled them to establish vast trade networks, linking distant parts of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Even today, modern shipbuilders look to the innovations of Viking shipbuilding when designing ships capable of navigating difficult waters. The Vikings were also instrumental in shaping the development of trade in medieval Europe. Their vast trading networks stretched from the British Isles to the Volga River, and from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle. Through their extensive exploration and trading, the Vikings helped establish the foundations for the global trade networks that would dominate in later centuries. They traded in a wide range of goods, including furs, amber, slaves, and weapons, and they brought back luxury goods such as silk, silver, and spices from the distant lands they visited. The Vikings' role as merchants was as important as their role as warriors, and they played a significant part in the economic development of Europe and beyond. The Viking influence on trade can still be seen today in the global commerce that connects nations across continents. In addition to their linguistic, legal, and commercial contributions, the Vikings also left a lasting cultural legacy, particularly through their art and literature. Viking art, with its intricate designs and symbolism, continues to captivate people around the world. The distinctive style of Viking art, characterized by flowing lines, interlacing patterns, and stylized depictions of animals, was evident in everything from the carvings on ships to the decoration of weapons and everyday objects. The Vikings' mastery of metalworking and wood carving produced some of the most beautiful artifacts of the early medieval period. These pieces are not only valuable for their artistic merit but also for what they reveal about Viking society, its beliefs, values, and connection to the natural world. Perhaps the most enduring cultural legacy of the Vikings is their mythology. The sagas, epic tales of gods, heroes, and monsters, were passed down through generations and remain a key part of Western literary tradition. The stories of Odin, Thor, Freya, and Loki, along with the heroic deeds of Viking kings and warriors, have been preserved in the sagas of Icelandic literature. These tales, which were originally passed down orally, are rich in themes of fate, honor, and destiny, and they offer a window into the Viking worldview. The sagas were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries but preserve the beliefs and stories of the Viking Age. These stories continue to inspire modern writers, filmmakers, and artists, and the figures of Norse mythology have remained central to Western popular culture, from the Marvel comics and films to modern fantasy literature. The Vikings' influence also extended to religion, particularly through the spread of Christianity. Although the Vikings themselves were pagan, the expansion of Christianity in Europe eventually led to the Christianization of Scandinavia. This process began in the 9th century and was largely completed by the 12th century. While the Vikings' pagan beliefs were gradually replaced by Christianity, their conversion to the new religion was not a simple or uniform process. Some Vikings embraced Christianity with enthusiasm, while others resisted, clinging to their old gods and customs. The conversion to Christianity, however, helped solidify the Vikings' place within the broader European cultural and religious landscape. The Vikings' adoption of Christianity also marked the beginning of a new era in Scandinavian history, one in which they would become part of the Christian kingdoms of Europe. The Vikings' legacy is not confined to Europe alone. Their exploration, trade, and cultural exchange with other parts of the world left an imprint on the Middle East, Central Asia, and even North America. The Viking trade routes connected distant peoples, from the Byzantine Empire to the Islamic caliphates, and the cultural exchange between these civilizations left lasting marks on both sides. Viking influence can still be seen in archaeological discoveries across Europe, Asia, and North America. Artifacts, runic inscriptions, and even the remnants of Viking settlements continue to be uncovered, offering new insights into the extent of their reach and their lasting impact. As a result, the Viking legacy endures in many ways, shaping not only the cultures they touched but also our understanding of history. The stories of their raids, their exploration, and their settlement are no longer just the stuff of legend but of lived reality. The Viking Age may have ended, but the ideas and ideals that defined the Vikings, their courage, resilience, and thirst for discovery, continue to resonate with us today. In literature, in history, and in popular culture, the Vikings remain one of the most compelling and influential civilizations of the medieval world, their legacy enduring in the modern imagination. The Vikings were more than just fearsome warriors or legendary explorers. They were a deeply structured society, with complex social roles, traditions, and values that influenced every aspect of their daily life. Viking society was built around family, honor, and the land, with each individual playing a crucial role in the survival and prosperity of the community. From chieftains and kings to farmers and craftsmen, the Vikings created a society that was surprisingly sophisticated, especially when compared to other cultures of their time. Their social structures were fluid, yet rooted in a strict hierarchy, with distinct roles for men and women, as well as a deep respect for the natural world. At the top of the Viking social ladder stood the kings and chieftains. These leaders were not just political figures. They were warriors, judges, and priests rolled into one. The Viking king's power was not absolute, however. He was expected to rule with the consent of the people, and he was bound by an unwritten code of honor and duty. A Viking king had to be a proven warrior, skilled in both battle and diplomacy. His rule was often challenged or confirmed through his ability to win battles, gather wealth, and distribute it generously among his followers. In Viking society, leadership was not about divine right or inherited privilege. It was about merit, power, and respect earned through deeds. Beneath the kings and chieftains were the freemen, or carls. The carls were the backbone of Viking society. They were farmers, traders, craftsmen, and warriors, and they enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy. Unlike peasants in other societies, the freemen of Viking society had land, livestock, and the right to participate in legal matters through the thing, the assembly where disputes were settled and laws were made. Many freemen also served as warriors when needed, forming the bulk of the Viking armies that went on raids and expeditions. The carls were the ones who worked the land, built the ships, and maintained the farms that provided the sustenance for the Viking people. Their role was crucial in maintaining the stability and wealth of Viking communities.